group leader in Murdoch Children's Research Institute in Melbourne. He is a professor of international child health in Menzies School of Health Research in Darwin. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, let's all welcome Dr. Edward Ken Mulholland.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organisers for giving me a chance to speak. I'm a little bit embarrassed in some ways because I know that I'm speaking to an audience that has a huge experience with the problem of childhood pneumonia. But I hope that my comments and my perspectives will be of interest to you as we go through this talk. It's not going to be comprehensive, but I want to focus on particular issues that are topical at the moment. Now, I don't need to say to this audience what childhood pneumonia is, but what I want to speak about in some detail is what is the true cause of pneumonia. And if you go to a group of medical students or young doctors and ask them that question, they'll immediately say, oh, it's pneumococcus or Haemophilus influenzae, or it's caused by viruses like influenza and RSV, which is true. But I think that there is a little bit more to it, and I'll come to that now. Now, one of the things that's bothered me through my career has been why this problem that is clearly the most important pediatric problem in the world has such a poor profile. There's no major effort like you see with AIDS, TB and malaria, and yet malaria causes much less deaths internationally than pneumonia does. It's something that's bothered me, and I went back to the historical literature to try and understand that. And actually, even in the 19th century, in the very old books, when they talked about childhood mortality in Britain and America and so on, they talk about scarlet fever, about measles, of course, and smallpox, but very little talk about pneumonia. And I think part of the reason for this is because it was historically regarded as an endogenous cause of mortality. In other words, it was the end result of a process that was basically poverty and malnutrition. And the child essentially died from poverty and malnutrition, and the mode of death was pneumonia. So it tended to be left aside. But there was another reason which I want to get to here. Now, people will probably be familiar with the name of William Osler, who was one of the most famous physicians of the late 19th and early 20th century. But Osler, writing in 1897, wrote the following: on the prognosis of pneumonia, the old are likely to die, the young to recover. Mortality in children has ranged from 1.9 to 3.3%. On the other hand, over 60 years of age, the death rate is very high, 50, 60 or even 80%. Now sometimes my students get confused by this. What was Osler thinking? He was one of the great physicians of his time, and yet when we go back and look at the causes of death in the United States at the turn of the 20th century, pneumonia was the overwhelming cause of death. So what was he thinking about? And I think he was thinking about this. This is also from the pre-antibiotic era from New York. And this is data on the case fatality rates for children admitted to pneumonia, admitted to hospital with pneumonia. And what you can see is a very intense age effect. If you're under 2 years of age, and particularly if you're under 1 year of age, mortality is very high. There's a high case fatality rate without antibiotics. But for children over the age of 3, it was very low, around 2 or 3%, and this is in fact what Osler was talking about. And one thing that surprised me when I was investigating this was that up to the beginning of the 20th century, even the famous paediatric hospitals in London did not admit young children under 2. So in a way, it comes back to the attitudes of those early days that babies, for example, were not seen in the same way as normal human beings, and were not counted. So when Osler was talking about children, he's talking about children over 3. Now this is the problem, and I put this slide up not to point out that the WHO says that there are 920,000 pneumonia deaths a year in children. But really just to point out that this is a large problem. This figure is a modelled figure. We really don't know what the true number of deaths is, because most deaths are occurring outside of the health system. And particularly when you go to very poor countries with poorly functioning health systems, pneumonia is still a major cause of death because many children simply fail to reach a health facility. It's responsible for about 16% of child deaths. And in general, the data shows that where mortality is higher, the proportion of deaths due to pneumonia is higher. And this fact is used by modellers to then project what is the total number of deaths per country according to what the infant and child mortality rate is for that country. And that sort of works except for one thing, and that is that it assumes that the country is homogeneous. It assumes that if a country sees a drop in under 5 mortality rate of 20 or 30 or 50% in some cases, that there is a predictable drop in the proportion of deaths due to pneumonia. But in many countries, as we're seeing now improvements in child survival, there are whole communities that are left out. And so if you are living in a community that's excluded from the benefits in the country, and this is true in countries like the Philippines as much as anywhere else, within those communities the proportion of pneumonia deaths will remain high. And I think this is a point that's lost on those who present these kind of international figures. The last point I want to make as well is about chronic lung disease. There's been rather little spoken about this. What are the long-term complications of severe bacterial pneumonia in children? We tend to think, oh, they make a full recovery, the chest x-ray returns to something like normal, so everything is fine. There is one review that was published a few years ago that seemed to suggest that there was long-term restrictive lung disease, but I found that to be a very unconvincing study. And basically what's needed is long-term follow-up with children, and up to now we don't have this information. So I want to think for a minute now about, again, how does pneumonia happen and what causes pneumonia? And if one imagines this as a sort of stylized picture of the respiratory tract, as a sort of simple doctor, I've always wondered, how is it that this part of the body is meant to be sterile, and this part of the body is loaded with bacteria? We know that the nasopharynx of virtually every human being is loaded with bacteria, and in children, in especially poor circumstances, you can find all the bacteria that cause pneumonia in the upper airways. So how does this happen? You know, this is a continuity. Every time the child takes a breath, the air goes over this heavily infected upper airways down into these apparently sterile lungs. I've always found this to be quite interesting, and I think this has become a topic of some research now as people start to speak about the microbiome, recognition that it's really not fully sterile. But there is an equilibrium that develops within the lung between the alveoli, the alveolar area where the oxygen is moving directly into the bloodstream, and there is a direct interface between the bloodstream, which certainly has to be sterile, and the environment. And then the upper airways where the bacteria lie. And this is what probably happens in health. You have some bacteria in the alveoli, and then as you move up, it becomes quite heavy colonisation in the upper airways. And obviously, alveolar immunity is an important part of this. And we all know about alveolar macrophages, and there's quite a lot of work going on about how the immune system functions at the alveolar level. As we know, immunology is really made up of a bunch of cartoons, and this is a cartoon. But it's not really the whole story, because you can't imagine that this is the mechanism by which the lungs stay sterile. Much more important is the cilia, and the cilia that move mucus continuously up the airways and take dust and infected droplets and bacteria and all things that people are breathing in all the time, up and to the upper airways where, in the case of children, it's generally swallowed. And this is the basic mechanism that actually stops people from getting pneumonia. But some children do get pneumonia, and it's then worth thinking about what the risk factors are and how those risk factors actually feed into this disease process. Now we know that, as I've already said, heavy bacterial colonisation is the rule for the upper airways, certainly for children living in high-risk environments. Smoke is a major issue, actually. And for children living in poor circumstances, the smoke is often coming from indoor air pollution associated with cooking, in some parts of the world with heating. Increasingly, children are being exposed to environmental smoke, and I'll come back to this a little bit later and show you some of the cities in the world that are getting worse and where this is clearly a factor in childhood pneumonia. Viral infections are probably important, precipitating the movement of bacteria from the upper airways down to the bottom. But malnutrition is overwhelmingly the most important risk factor for death from pneumonia. After all, death from pneumonia is really a death from poverty and malnutrition. So how does this work? There's been a lot of research done, particularly in the 20 or 30 years ago, on the immunological cost of malnutrition. But unfortunately, a good deal of that research was either poor quality and in some cases actually fabricated. And we're not really sure what the immune function, the immune problems are with malnutrition. But people who've looked after, and many, I think most of you have looked after severely malnourished children, you just need to watch the child coughing. Because if the cilia is part of the normal function, that is supported by the cough reflex. You cough to get rid of that stuff which is in the lower airways and bring it to the top. And watching a severely malnourished child try to cough is, as you know, a very sad experience, and you can see that the cough becomes really ineffective. And so for me, thinking this through, the surprising thing is not that some or many children with malnutrition finish up getting pneumonia. It's why all of them don't have pneumonia, because the defence mechanisms are so disturbed by malnutrition. This photograph I took a few years ago in Guinea-Bissau, and this child, I think, demonstrates all of the important risk factors associated with childhood pneumonia. Here's a child who is malnourished. He's living in an environment where he sleeps in a very small room with, I think, 3 other children, and actually animals in this case. No ventilation. The house is constantly full of smoke from cooking. And importantly, this child lived in a village where there is actually no health care whatsoever. So if this child gets sick, he's very likely to get pneumonia and quite likely to die. And sadly, there are still many children in the world living in those kind of circumstances. So if I come back to the question now and say, what actually causes pneumonia? Well, again, it's poverty and malnutrition that causes pneumonia, accentuated by smoke, and increasingly as the overall pneumonia burden becomes less in countries and as health improves, we start to see more and more cases that are associated with chronic health problems, particularly neurological disorders or HIV. The precipitating factors I've spoken about, viral infection, the biggest one by far is which sadly is still with us, especially in the Philippines. But then also RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, and then the colonising bacteria, which is the medical students' answer for what is the cause of pneumonia, and they are, of course, always present in the upper airways of children. Now, most of these factors are, in fact, preventable or treatable. Certainly, you could say, well, poverty and malnutrition is preventable. I find it terrible that endemic malnutrition remains a problem in so many countries today. Smoke is preventable, but it's very difficult, and for governments it's a very difficult issue to deal with. HIV is treatable, bacterial infections are treatable, and the viral infections are, at least some are preventable. Measles is preventable, and I'm hopeful that within the next 5 to 10 years we'll see a vaccine to prevent respiratory syncytial virus. So, I'll come on to treatment a little bit, and just going to make a few comments about treatment. Treatment is pretty straightforward. After all, it's antibiotics, oxygen if needed, and then in some cases respiratory support, which can be formal intensive care type of respiratory support, or simpler methods like bubble CPAP. Supportive care like fluids and nutrition are often forgotten. But one of the questions that's I think foremost in the international community at the moment is who should be treated in hospital and who should be treated at home. Now this is a health centre that I visited and did a kind of an evaluation on a few years ago. It's in a very poor part of Ethiopia, in a remote highland area, and it's an area where there is no access to any other health facility basically, and it serves a very large population. And you might look at this and think, well, this is a place that can't be very functional. It looks like it's sort of falling down, and it really is a kind of depressing place. But actually, when we looked carefully at what was going on in this health centre, it was providing a really good service for the community. The health workers were following the integrated management of childhood illness quite closely. The stocks, the drugs, the essential drugs that were present, and we got the impression that they were doing a pretty good job for their community just with this basic health care. And then when we were able to actually measure child mortality in the area served by this particular health centre, what we saw was something quite interesting. There were actually something like isobars of risk as you moved out from the health centre. So as you moved away from the health centre, mortality, particularly mortality from pneumonia, which is the dominant cause of child death in Ethiopia, got higher and higher. And for me that was reasonably good evidence that that health centre was doing a reasonably good job. So what can they do at that facility? Well, they can identify the children who need to be treated with antibiotics, which is in that case usually amoxicillin. And more importantly, they can identify those children who need to be referred to hospital. And even in that very difficult place, there was a possibility of referral, although I have to say there was not very much possibility of referral, but there was some possibility of referral. So the question is, which children should the health workers in that facility, and there are many other facilities in the world that look a bit like that, which children should they be referring, recognising that the referral often takes a long time, it may be costly, it may be costing the parents in terms of their time, taking them away from their work, their farms, but also in some cases it may cost them a lot of money. So it's a very important decision. And the WHO recommendation which children should be referred on have for a long time followed what was originally the case management strategy for pneumonia, which was developed in part in the Philippines here. But then what became integrated management of childhood illness, or IMCI. And very young children, first few months of life, have a low threshold for referring those to hospital. And then any children with the danger signs of malnutrition, poor conscious state, convulsions, and I think increasingly now hypoxia measured by pulse oximetry. And we're starting to see in Africa the use of pulse oximetry at health facilities like the one that I've just shown you as a way of trying to evaluate which children need to be referred on. But most controversial of all is the question about lower chest wall pneumonia. Because the case management strategy that was developed in the 1980s and as I said, was implemented strongly in this country and many other countries, relied on chest wall indrawing, lower chest wall indrawing, as a key sign to indicate which children are severe enough to send to hospital. And recently, that's been changed. And this slide, which is from the IMCI training materials, showing the sort of standard way that health workers are supposed to be evaluating children, and I think everybody here is probably familiar with this. But the chest wall indrawing has now been moved into the yellow section in the middle. In other words, children who have chest wall indrawing but no danger signs are now recommended to be treated at home with antibiotics. And this is an issue that, as I say, has caused a lot of concern, particularly in Africa. So the old algorithm on the left here, which is a little bit more complicated because there are two red areas, one of which is basically for children who have lower chest wall indrawing, and the other is for danger signs. This was the basis of this component of IMCI. Has now been replaced by this system on the right. The system on the right actually looks simpler. Maybe it looks better, but it's an important change, and the question is it a valid change? And this is the lower chest wall enduring, the dropping of that as a criteria for admission to hospital is something which I think we have to think very carefully about. This particular sign, this child is in Africa demonstrating the sign really. This particular sign has been associated with high mortality. In a recent study that was published only last month in the Lancet Global Health, and in that study, about a third of the children who died in a very large area in Kenya, a third of the children who died from pneumonia actually would not have been referred to hospital with the current WHO recommendations, in part because of the absence of lower chest wall enduring as a referral criterion. So this debate is very much on, and if you want to read more about it, you can also read this paper which we published last month in the Lancet Global Health, highlighting this particular controversy. So once the child gets to the hospital, what happens next? Well, they receive antibiotics, then they may receive oxygen if needed, and whether the oxygen should be administered sooner or later, I think is a really important question that should be examined further. But they also should be receiving supportive nutrition, fluids, and supportive care. So the control of pneumonia by adequate treatment is something which is mostly managed at that level. In other words, the district hospital and the community level. Of course, many cases will get to the tertiary hospitals, but I'm speaking now about high mortality settings. So speaking now a little bit about prevention, I want to state the obvious, and the obvious thing is that if we really wanted to control the global problem of childhood pneumonia, we would do something to prevent malnutrition and poverty. And I've no doubt that there are efforts going on to do this, but the progress seems to be very, very slow. We would also do something about indoor air pollution and air quality. It surprised me when I was working at WHO to find that there were many people who didn't actually believe that smoke was associated with childhood pneumonia. They say, oh, everyone's always supposed to smoke. And what evidence have you got that smoke is associated with childhood pneumonia? And the evidence that we had at the time was a bunch of observational studies that showed you that children who lived in smoking environments, who were for the most part poor children living in poor circumstances, had more pneumonia. And this was not considered to be confirmatory evidence. So this study was designed, and this was designed as a randomized trial to try to demonstrate that if you do reduce indoor air pollution at the community level, in the household, that will have an effect on childhood pneumonia rates. And the study, which was completed in Guatemala, was conducted in a setting where the indoor environment for most children looked a little bit like this. Cooking was done indoors on an open fire, so it's a very smoky environment. And the intervention looked like this. The intervention was a stove that was designed in Guatemala. It made a huge difference to the quality of life of the women and the families, but it also was shown to cause a significant reduction in the risk of pneumonia. And you might say, well, that's a study that's demonstrated something that's obvious. It might be obvious, but it wasn't that obvious to the World Bank and to other people who were involved in trying to work on the air pollution issues. But when we think about air pollution, there are still some terrible places in the world. And this is one where I have a project at the moment looking at childhood pneumonia. This is Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. And if this slide looks like a fairly miserable, cold sort of place, I have to tell you that when I took this photograph, it was minus 35 degrees. And people were living in these houses. This was in the capital city of Mongolia. A large proportion of the population still live in these traditional houses, which are really like one-room tents. And they're heated by a small stove which burns raw coal. So they're burning coal inside the house. The coal then, the smoke then comes out these little chimneys and then produces a huge mass of coal smoke covering the whole district. And the rates of respiratory disease in children growing up in this environment are horrific. And amazingly, amongst the children in our study, more than half of them who lived in this type of environment had more than one cigarette smoker living in the house with them. Up to 10 people living in one of these places. So imagine if you're a child living in there, you've got the environment quite crowded, already full of coal and smoke, and then somebody, sometimes several people in the house are also smoking cigarettes. And when you live in this kind of environment, you don't open the door or the window because it's freezing outside. So there is no ventilation at all. You can't imagine what a toxic and terrible place that is for a child's lungs. So, I'll come back a little bit to that, but prevention in terms of air quality is something that really has to be taken seriously. But prevention in terms of vaccination is also important. And the most important vaccine in terms of for preventing pneumonia globally has been measles vaccine. When I did my first project here in 1989, actually in San Lazaro Hospital in Manila, I saw a large number of pneumonia cases, and I think almost every child was either in the acute stages of measles or had recently had measles. And the situation now is better, but sadly measles are still circulating in this country. We saw this slide yesterday morning in the presentation from WHO. This is data on reported measles cases for this WHO region, the Western Pacific region by country. I was intrigued by the yellow bars, which is China, and why the yellow bars show such a marked seasonality, which is interesting. The blue bars here that represent the measles epidemic in the Philippines in 2014. But what I want to highlight is the brown one, this one here, which is Mongolia. Now Mongolia is quite a small country, as I've already shown you a slide from Mongolia. But they had measles controlled quite nicely up to 2015. In fact, in the early part of 2015, they were declared by WHO to be measles-free, given a kind of certificate or something. And I always think that this is a mistake, because measles was already circulating continuously in China, and there was continuous movement of people between China and Mongolia. It seemed to me to be rather hopeful to think that Mongolia would remain measles-free, and it didn't. And there was this very strange epidemic that appeared. It appeared in two halves. In 2015, there was a big epidemic, and there were essentially two communities who were getting measles. One was young adults who probably were not adequately vaccinated, going back to the fall of the Soviet Union and the problems of public health in the 1990s. And the other was children under the age of 6 months. And in the 2015 component of the epidemic, there was a large number of cases and 6 deaths. And the deaths were all in children under 6 months. In the following year, I mean, the government actually believed at the end of 2015 that the problem was solved. And there was a lot of talk about doing campaigns and so on, and it became a little bit, they got distracted by other issues, and nothing much happened. I shouldn't say it like that. They did actually move forward and do a campaign that addressed the known susceptible groups, but nevertheless, by 2016, there was suddenly a resurgence of this epidemic, and that resurgence was associated with a much higher case fatality rate in young children. And those 111 deaths that were described in that half of the epidemic represented a case fatality rate that was more than 10 times as high as it was in the previous year. Very hard to understand this, and the investigators from CDC have put forward the proposition that this is due to the coincidence of an influenza epidemic at the same time. And that may actually be true, that some children, by getting both viruses at the same time, have a much worse outcome. We've just had an excellent session on pertussis. I don't want to say much about pertussis except to, I guess, remind us that pertussis vaccine is, of course, very important for the prevention of pneumonia. Haemophilus influenzae type B vaccine was introduced in December 1990, initially in the United States. For somebody of my generation, this made a phenomenal difference to the practice of paediatrics. In the 1980s, as clinicians in Australia, paediatricians were living in fear of HIV. Most meningitis cases were caused by this organism. We had epiglottitis. We had roughly 50 epiglottitis cases per year in the hospital I was working in. We also had other invasive disease, septic arthritis, sometimes overwhelming sepsis associated with HIV. So the introduction of HIV vaccine completely changed the practice of paediatrics in Australia and in many other countries of the world. But it also reduced the pneumonia burden a bit, but probably not more than 20 to 25%. 2017, 27 years now since the introduction of HIV vaccine, and the map looks like this. This shows that most children in the world now have access to HIV vaccine. It's interesting that there are 3 countries that do not use HIV vaccine in the national program: Russia, China and Thailand. My understanding is that Thailand is planning to introduce it this year. But it is interesting that after such a long gap, that those countries should be not using the vaccine. I should point out that a lot of children in China and Russia do receive the vaccine through the private sector. But that comes then to pneumococcal vaccine. And pneumococcal vaccine is then seen as a big one. Here is the next really big vaccine for the prevention of child mortality. Probably responsible for more than 50% of pneumonia deaths. We don't really know that proportion. But it's a little bit more complicated as a vaccine. It's a conjugate vaccine, like the HIV vaccine, but there are more than 90 serotypes of pneumococcus, and each one has its own immune protection. So the development of a vaccine was a tricky business, and it was necessary to choose the serotypes that cause most disease. And that choice of serotypes led to the first pneumococcal conjugate vaccine being licensed in February of 2000, in fact, exactly 18 years ago now, in the United States. And that was PCV7 or Prevnar 7, which was a 7-valent pneumococcal vaccine. That's since been superseded by 2 other vaccines, PCVs 10 and 13, produced by GSK and Pfizer respectively. And these vaccines were licensed in 2009 and 2010 and are used in many parts of the world. A lot of people raise the question and say, well, which one of these vaccines is better? I've actually been asked this question by authorities in a number of different countries. And so the usual answer is to say, well, what are your serotypes? People think, well, 13 must be better than 10, so you often go with 13. I should point out that if you look around the world today, roughly equal numbers of children are receiving each of those 2 vaccines. So the market is not that different. But we've done what I think is probably the first direct head-to-head comparison of these 2 vaccines to try and see which one is better. First thing to notice, though, is that there is 3 serotypes that are present in 13 that are not present in 10. The first of these is serotype 3. Now, serotype 3 was removed from the GSK vaccine, which was originally an 11-valent vaccine, because the trials showed that it didn't work. It was ineffective. But serotype 3 in the Pfizer 13-valent vaccine also may not work. In fact, the evidence from the US and UK remains problematic. There may be some protection against serotype 3, but if there is, it's quite small. Serotype 3 is a very difficult serotype to protect against. The other 2 serotypes then are 6A and 19A. 6A is a very important serotype. There was always a belief that 6B, which was present both in the PCV7 and the PCV10, would provide cross-protection against 6A disease. And I think now that there is evidence that that is the case. Although I would suggest that there is also evidence that the protection from the 13-valent vaccine against 6A disease, particularly ear disease, is probably better than the protection of the 10-valent vaccine against 6A. For 19, it's more difficult because 19A was the dominant replacement serotype that came up after PCV7 was introduced. And so it was very important for Wyeth and then later Pfizer to put 19A into their vaccine. And the vaccine appears to be protected against 19A. But the PCV10 vaccine also provides protection against 19A. Probably not as good, but there is certainly evidence of protection for PCV10 as well against 19A. The difference seems to be in terms of the mucosal immunity, that for both in terms of both the 6A and the 19A protection from PCV10, the protection against carriage is less, and therefore the indirect protection amongst the elderly in the community for those particular serotypes is less with PCV10. On the other hand, there is also the potential, which is still unresolved, I would say, for Haemophilus influenzae protection with the 10-valent vaccine. And there is evidence from Australia, particularly use of the vaccine in children with chronic lung disease, which suggests that that is possibly quite real. I think the company is rather nervous about claiming anything, but that is still something to keep in the back of one's mind. So this is the only slide I'm going to show you with any data, and basically this is a head-to-head study of the two vaccines. This is just the antibody levels. There's a lot of other information that we'll be publishing this year. But it's a head-to-head study of the two vaccines given in a 2+1 schedule. So 2 doses at 2 months and 4 months, and then a booster dose at 9 months. And we took bloods at multiple intervals during that time. If you look on this rather complicated series of graphs, the red lines are PCV13 and the blue lines are PCV10. And the pattern that you can see for most, but not all serotypes, is that after the primary series, PCV13 antibody levels are higher. But once you go out for a few months and before the booster dose, it returns to normal, and in fact there's a tendency for them to cross. And even after the booster dose, then PCV13 levels are higher for most serotypes, but not all. And then once you go out to 18 months, as we've done, the lines sort of cross and they're about equal. But the other thing which is not evident from looking at this graph, you can't see very clearly, is that we also have data after the first dose. And after one dose only of both of the vaccines, the responses to PCV10 were generally a bit better than the PCV13 responses. So, which vaccine is better? I'm not sure. We tend to say, well, the PCV story is a wonderful success story. It's a great success. It's been licensed in February 2000, and look what we've achieved. There's been fantastic individual protection against the invasive disease. There's been protection of unvaccinated individuals, particularly described in the US. And Gavi recently, last year, estimated that 500,000 lives have been saved by the use of this vaccine. I wasn't able to see where the source of that figure is, and I'm not sure whether that's a model estimate or a guess. But nevertheless, the world map of PCV introduction looks a bit like the HIP map looked about 10 years ago. In other words, Africa and South America and so on are using the vaccine, Asia somewhat less. I would point out though, in India, starting last year, they've started to roll the vaccine out, and they've got at least 4 states in India are now using PCV13. However, Asia, generally speaking, has been behind, is not really using the vaccine. Indonesia's coloured yellow, but that's only a very small area where the vaccine is being used. The Philippines, the people who made this map have included the Philippines as green. I leave it up to you to decide whether that's appropriate or not. But it's not really so fantastic. I mean, it's now 18 years since the first PCV was introduced, and only 40% of the world's children actually have access to this. And I don't count that as a great success. The price continues to be a problem. Even 18 years after the vaccine was introduced, the price is prohibitive. And on top of that, we have global supply problems, and you can imagine how the India cohort of 26 million children has affected the global supply of vaccine. On top of that, there is a continuing problem of serotype replacement, and recent data from the UK has shown that serotype replacement is most evident not in the children who are being vaccinated, but in the elderly people who are contacts of those children, who are starting to get more disease caused by serotypes that were unusual years ago. So when I look at the vaccines that prevent major mortality in children, I wonder how well we've really done. Measles vaccine was introduced in the late 60s, really. I think the US it was 67, actually. So by 1990, when universal childhood immunisation was declared by WHO and UNICEF, it's my recollection that the global coverage was around 80%. That was certainly the target. Hib vaccine was introduced in 1990, and now in 2015 the estimate is that 80% of children in the world get Hib vaccine. So pneumococcal vaccine introduced in 2000, and the estimate is 40%. So for me this is not an overwhelming success. In fact, I think this is a problem. As somebody who's been involved in this for so many years, I feel unhappy about it. But the situation will change soon. There are new vaccines on the horizon, and I've listed most of them here. First thing to know is that the first two cabs off the rank, as they say, two tentative vaccines will be coming from Indian companies. The Panacea vaccine is, I think, already being used in India, I'm not sure exactly, but the Serum Institute of India vaccine is at the moment in phase 3 trial and is expected to go for donor qualification sometime quite soon. And my guess is that that will probably be the next big pneumococcal vaccine. And the price of that vaccine is not going to be anything like the price of the current vaccines that we're looking at. There are other approaches also underway. For example, Biopharma Indonesia is working on a wholesale vaccine, which is quite a novel approach, which will not be serotype specific like the conjugate vaccines. And then we have to recognise that there are other viral vaccines, particularly RSV, which could actually lead to a huge reduction in pneumococcal disease for reasons that I don't have time to go into. So I won't go through this again. I just wanted to show you this picture from Mongolia because it does highlight what it's like in this country, and it's a tough place to live, and it's a very tough place to be a child. So what can we do then to prevent pneumonia in children? Firstly, we can improve nutrition, and all of the strategies that are available to improve birth weight, reduce the incidence of low birth weight, should be looked at. Improvements in nutrition, the improvements in exclusive breastfeeding, optimal weaning, and so forth, is part of the prevention of pneumonia. It must be, because that's really where the problem comes from. We should also recognise that increasingly children are caught up in the political shenanigans of their adult carers, and you don't need to see, you can't turn on the television these days without seeing horrific pictures from Syria of children who not only are caught up in the business of war, but appear to be targeted in war, and actually health facilities being targeted in war as well. We as paediatricians should really stand by and watch this happening. It is really an appalling trend in recent years. And not only children who are caught in war, but children who are caught in refugee settings, who are with their families trying to cross, for example, out of some of the more troubled parts of Africa. This is all happening today as we speak. And when you go to the environments, the camps and the places where these communities are living, the rates of pneumonia are extreme. So the Children Fund and MSF have taken this on now as a major priority, and they've made a major push for control of childhood pneumonia. A few of my comments, my political comments at the bottom there. The arms industry is a very interesting industry. My country, Australia, recently announced that the government recently announced that in their wisdom they've decided that we're going to become a major arms exporter in the next 10 years. So that's really wonderful news. And when you look at the arms that are used in the most terrible situations in the world where conflict is taking place, who are the people making those guns and those weapons? And quite often you'll find Britain, the United States, Russia, Italy. I mean, it's this is the problem, and I'm not embarrassed about the last comment that I put up there on the slide about deranged, often elderly men running countries. I'm actually 65 at the moment, and I think I'm probably too old already. So finally, on the care of children with pneumonia, I just want to highlight the point I made before. I think there is a continuing process of the evaluation of the WHO strategy, which needs to be looked at and looked at fairly carefully. And I think the trend in the future is going to be for countries to have to focus on the identifying the high-risk communities. As the general health in countries like the Philippines improves, child mortality continues to decline, and many and major advances are made, it's important then to start to identify and target the communities that are left out. And I think that will be a challenge for us in the future. So, in my conclusion, children should be protected in all areas of civil conflict and refugee settings. All children deserve the right deserve access to routine life-saving vaccines, and these include pneumococcal vaccine. And I don't buy all this stuff about intellectual property and everything, I'm sorry. These vaccines, for the most part, the great inventions that led to conjugate vaccine development were made in academic centres, particularly in the United States. And actually one of the reasons why hip vaccine price dropped fairly rapidly after it was introduced was because one of the inventors, John Robbins, one of the most brilliant scientists of his time, actually chose not to patent the PRPT vaccine when he invented it. The long-term effects of air pollution and in fact the changing environment in general need to be documented much better. We're speculating about what this smoke does to children, especially in places like Mongolia, but we don't know. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I invite you to come to the International Symposium on Pneumococcal